teams are wanting to closely monitor that there isn't any leaks or any issues when we are starting our propellant loading operations. Now, following slow fill, teams will then transition into what is called fast fill. Similarly to how slow fill refers to going slowly, fast fill means we're going to go at a much faster rate. This will be the bulk of our propellant loading operations, where teams are going to be in fast fill for the majority of the time. Now, following fast fill, we will then transition into topping. Topping just means that we are going to finish that last little bit that is needed to get us to 100% level in those tanks. Now, because these are gases, these are liquid gases, as the temperatures start warming up, those gases will, that liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen will start venting off into a gas. Because of this, following topping, teams will then transition into what is called replenish mode. Replenish means just that. They're just going to constantly be replenishing these tanks so that we make sure we're at 100% level and we are at that flight ready level for when we enter terminal count. Now, I'll be reporting out as each of these operations and milestones are underway. Our Artemis launch team, they're currently communicating with each other through these separate communications channels that I'll be tuning into. And I'll make sure to relay as that information gets underway and they report those milestones and callouts out. Now, while we wait for slow fill to get underway, let's do a little bit of a recap of the entire countdown. Again, we said we started on Monday at 4:44 p.m. Eastern Time. So shortly after the countdown started ticking down, teams filled the water tank for the sound suppression system. Now, this is done to help protect the rocket and the supporting ground structures that are there at the launch pad from the extreme heat and the power that's generated from the rocket's exhaust. And it also helps suppress the sound that's produced at liftoff. Now, the Orion spacecraft, the core stage, which again is that first stage of the SLS rocket, and the interim cryogenic propulsion stage, or the upper or second stage of SLS, were also all powered up for launch. The Orion and the core stage flight batteries have been charged. And at 4:14 a.m. Eastern Time this morning, teams started what is called the air to gaseous nitrogen, or GN2 changeover. Now, this is a very important milestone to meet. Our launch director, technical assistant, Mari Forrestdale, kind of described it to as it's when we're really getting ready to get the party started. The reason for this is because it basically signals the team that we are on track to be go for propellant loading later in the countdown. And the reason for that is because the air to gaseous nitrogen changeover basically is helping prevent any potential fire hazards. It's creating a clean, inert environment inside the vehicle so that then when we are putting in those hazardous propellants, there aren't any issues. So that started at 4:14 a.m. this morning, and it was completed at 7:14 a.m. Eastern Time. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the countdown for Artemis II does have certain built-in holds throughout the count. We are currently in our first built-in holds, which lasts 2 hours and 45 minutes total. Like I said, we're still currently in it, and we do have roughly about 38 minutes and counting until we exit that first hold. The other additional built-in holds that have been put in the countdown, again, these are pauses that the team has purposely inserted to make sure that they can just get some extra cushion time if needed. That next one happens once we reach what is called all stages replenish. Now, all stages replenish just means that now the entire SLS rocket is fully fueled and teams are now just constantly replenishing all the tanks to make sure that it is always at 100% until we get into the final 10 minutes of the countdown. So when we reach all stages replenish, that's when the teams are going to be ready to send our astronauts to the launch pad. Because of this, the teams have inserted this extra hold. It's an hour and 10 minutes that will happen again when we are at all stages replenish. Following that, we then have just one final hold in the countdown, and that happens when we're then getting ready for terminal count. It'll be a 40-minute hold, and it will happen roughly again about 40 minutes before we enter then the last 10 minutes of the countdown. So to quickly recap again, our launch director, Charlie Blackwell-Thompson, she gave the go for teams to start propellant loading. We are currently in chill down for the core stage liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. Up next will be slow fill when we start loading that liquid propellant, and I will report out when that is underway. Welcome back. This is Artemis Launch Control. For those of you that are just now joining us, this is our NASA live coverage for the Artemis II mission. We are starting our propellant loading operations and we'll be giving you 24/7 live coverage starting with our tanking operations and continuing throughout the rest of this mission. We're here in Firing Room 1. You can see there on your screen, we have our Artemis launch team getting ready to launch the SLS, or Space Launch System rocket, and Orion spacecraft for the agency's Artemis II mission later this evening. Now that launch window opens at 6:24 p.m. Eastern Time today. The team do have a 2-hour launch window, which means that if we don't launch right at 6:24 p.m., they do have an additional 2 hours in which they can launch. Now, as you can see, it is a gorgeous, bright, and sunny day here on the Space Coast in Florida. Currently, you don't see any clouds inside, but I can confirm there are some pretty white, puffy clouds. They don't seem to be a threat. In fact, our launch weather officer, he told the launch team that they have favorable and acceptable weather, not only for tanking, but also throughout today's countdown. Now, the teams will continuing to monitor the weather forecast as we get closer to today's launch window. We're currently predicting 80% favorable weather conditions for that 2-hour launch window. We are currently 10 hours and 17 minutes and counting from the opening of the Artemis II mission. We are currently in what is called our chill down operations for the core stage liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen tank. Now, chill down refers to getting all the systems and lines very cold and ready to receive these super cold cryogenic propellants prior to starting our actual tanking loading operations. Now let's break down the SLS rocket. We start with the core stage. That is the first stage of the rocket. Then on top of the core stage, you have what is the upper stage, or that interim cryogenic propulsion stage. So in total for SLS, there are 2 stages, but there are 4 tanks in total. You have our liquid hydrogen tank on both the core stage and the upper stage, and a liquid oxygen in both. So 4 tanks total, both liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. The core stage holds roughly 733,000 gallons. The upper stage, meanwhile, holds 24,000, so much smaller in comparison. In fact, the core stage is one of the tallest stages, first stages of a rocket that NASA has ever used for its missions. It's roughly 212 feet tall. Now, fully fueled, SLS weighs approximately 5.74 million pounds. Before fueling, which is where we're currently at, it is 3.5 million pounds. So that means we're adding roughly 2.25 million pounds of propellant on board this rocket. That's quite a lot. Again, to quickly recap, we are in chill down. The next step will be when we enter slow fill. Slow fill refers to when we actually start those propellant loading operations. Teams will start to slowly load those cryogenic propellants on board the core stage. And then we will start transitioning where we're going a little bit quicker. We call that fast fill. So we will start flowing that propellant at a much faster rate. I'll continue reporting out as these milestones are underway. Now, on the spacecraft side, teams also have started what is called the Orion cold soak. Now, this basically refers to making everything super cold on the spacecraft. This is done in order to protect the avionics. So we're not chilling the crew module, but we're making the thermal control system cold so that it can withstand all of the different temperatures that it's going to be seeing throughout today's countdown. That started quickly after we gave the LD go for cryoload. Now, Artemis II is a test flight. We're going to send astronauts Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Cook, and Jeremy Hansen on a 10-day mission around the moon. This is the first crewed test flight for NASA's Artemis missions. And we're going to be testing the life support systems that are on board Orion. As well as conducting other operations and demonstrations throughout the mission so that we can pave the way for our future Artemis missions when we send our astronauts to the moon. In fact, one of the new operations or the new demonstrations that our astronauts will get to perform throughout this mission is what is called the proximity operations demonstration. So after launch, after the upper stage, this will be roughly about 50 minutes after launch, the upper stage is going to fire its RL-10 engine. It has one RL-10 engine at the bottom. It will fire its engine so that it starts a 30-second perigee raise maneuver burn. This is going to put the spacecraft, or the Orion spacecraft, this low point on its elliptical orbit as it's going around Earth. About an hour later, the upper stage will fire its engine again to begin a 20-minute apogee raise burn, in which point we're going to be sending the spacecraft to its highest point in its elliptical orbit around the Earth. Now, roughly 3 hours and 25 minutes into the mission, so this is about, again, 3.5 hours after launch, Orion will separate from the upper stage. At this point, this is when our astronauts, our crew on board, they're going to begin manually testing Orion's controls and steering thrusters so that they can start what is called this proximity operations demonstration. This is basically a series of maneuvers that are going to have the Artemis II crew flying Orion and practice approaching the upper stage and backing away for roughly 70 minutes. Now, the reason we're doing this test is so that, again, we can practice this for when we go and have Artemis III, and we actually have Orion practicing docking with our lunar landing systems. Now, it is important to note that Orion won't actually dock with the upper stage for Artemis II. Instead, it will get close and then drift and then go back and separate and then get close again. We really just want to practice those proximity operations to confirm we can do it. The spacecraft can get aligned with where it needs to be. And then following that, Orion will then fire its European service module engine for about 2 minutes so that it helps increase that separation distance from the upper stage. At this point, the upper stage will fire its thrusters just one final time so that it begins its disposal burn. Following that burn completion, that's when the small bread box size or those shoebox size secondary payloads that are currently inside the Orion stage adapter. If you see on your screen there, up at the top, we have our Orion spacecraft, and then underneath there will be the Orion stage adapter that is in between the upper stage and the spacecraft. It is where we currently house those secondary payloads. These are what are called a bunch of CubeSats. These are some science experiments that are being housed there, and then they will separate with the upper stage and go to their respective destinations to conduct their scientific data. Now again, once those are ejected from the Orion stage adapter, that's approximately 5.5 hours into the mission. The upper stage will then go back on its trajectory and will re-enter over the Pacific Ocean about 26 hours after launch. Now, during this time, the Orion will remain in a high Earth orbit for about 25 hours before it executes its translunar injection burn. Now, this is the burn that is needed so that it can head on and send our 4 astronauts around the moon and back. So that's just a little quick recap of what our next day looks like within the next 24 hours. But let's take you back to where we currently are at. Again, we are 10 hours and 8 minutes and counting from the opening of today's launch window. That launch window opens at 6:24 p.m. Eastern Time. We are currently in what is called chill down for the core stage liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. Next up will be slow fill when we start loading that liquid propellant, and I'll report out once that is underway. Welcome back. This is Artemis Launch Control. We are currently 9 hours and 49 minutes and counting until the opening of today's launch window for the Artemis II mission. Now that launch window opens at 6:24 p.m. Eastern Time this evening. Teams do have a 2-hour launch window, which means that if we don't open right at the start at 6:24, they do have an additional 2 hours in which they can try to launch. Now the Artemis launch team, which we see here on our screen, they are sitting on console getting ready to launch our Artemis II Moon rocket. Now the launch team just reported that we are now starting our propellant loading operations for the SLS, or the Space Launch System rocket. We are currently in slow fill for both the core stage liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen tanks. This means that propellant loading is officially underway. We are now starting to load those super cold, these cryogenic temperatures onto the SLS rocket. Now we're going to start from the bottom and make our way slowly up to the top. So we'll first start with loading the first stage of the rocket. That's what we call the core stage. It is the orange section of the rocket that you see there on your screen that sits between the two solid rocket boosters. Now we are currently again in slow fill for both liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen on that core stage. Slow fill refers to, as the name suggests, to slowly start loading that propellant. Now we do this because these tanks are really large. In fact, the core stage is one of the tallest first stages of a rocket. So that means these tanks are also very, very large. In fact, the liquid hydrogen tank on the core stage can hold roughly 537,000 gallons. And then on the liquid oxygen side, it holds roughly 196,000 gallons. So because of this, because these tanks are so large, teams will start slowly loading this propellant so that they can monitor how the tanks, how the hardware is receiving these super cold cryogenic propellants. Once it looks like everything is underway and there are no issues, they will then transition into what is called fast fill, which is where we'll stay for the majority of our tanking operations. Fast fill means we'll now start loading the rocket at a much faster rate. Now, before the rocket is fueled, SLS weighs approximately 3.5 million pounds, but fully fueled, it's 5.74 million pounds. And we are starting to fuel that rocket, so it is going to start getting heavier and heavier. Now, we mentioned how the core stage, that is the largest segment of the SLS rocket. In fact, it's one of the tallest first stages of a rocket that NASA has ever used. It's roughly 212 feet tall. Now on top of it sits the upper stage, or the interim cryogenic propulsion stage. Now that's roughly 45 feet tall in comparison. And then on top of that, you have what is called the Orion stage adapter. It is actually the smallest part of the SLS rocket, and it is what holds our CubeSats. These are these shoebox-sized payloads, or these scientific payloads that will be sent off into space following the separation of the upper stage from the Orion spacecraft. Now, it is the smallest part of the rocket at only roughly 5 feet tall. And then, of course, on top of the Orion stage adapter sits our Orion spacecraft. You can see there on your screen the Orion spacecraft, that's on top. And then right there where we have our Artemis logo, that is what is actually called the crew access arm. It is part of the mobile launcher. That is the gray L-shaped structure that is connected to the SLS and Orion spacecraft rocket. Now, the crew access arm is very important, as again, that name suggests, it is the access point for our astronauts, or really any personnel, to be able to access the spacecraft. So that is where, in fact, our astronauts, Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Cook, and Jeremy Hansen, they'll be walking through there later on today when they are ready to board their spacecraft for their mission around the moon. So to quickly recap, we are now in slow fill for both liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen. On the core stage, that is again the first stage of the SLS rocket. Following that, we will transition into fast fill, and I'll report out when that is officially underway. Now, while we wait to get into fast fill, teams are currently not monitoring any big issues in the countdown. It's actually been, things have been going really smoothly, fairly well. We are definitely hoping for things to continue that way. But let's talk a little bit about how everything that the teams had to do to get us to this point. So teams first rolled the SLS rocket and Orion spacecraft to the launch pad for the first time on January 17th. Then on February 2nd, teams performed a wet dress rehearsal. Now, this was a rehearsal to practice loading the propellants on board the rocket, getting into terminal count, but not actually launching. So it was like a practice test before launch. During that first wet dress rehearsal in February, we experienced the hydrogen leak, which, following that test, teams then decided to perform another wet dress rehearsal. They did so on February 19th, and it was very successful. They didn't really see any hydrogen leaks throughout the entire count, or any other leaks for that matter, and they were able to continue throughout all of the milestones that they had planned. Now, we did have to roll back on February 25th due to a helium issue that we saw on the upper stage of our rocket. Teams noticed that the flow of helium to the upper stage was interrupted, and that meant that we had to roll back to the vehicle assembly building to help fix that issue. The only way to access that area was inside the VAB. Teams did successfully fix the issue inside the vehicle assembly building, and we were then ready to roll back to the launch pad on March 20th. Since then, the teams have been getting the rocket then ready for launch, and we entered our launch countdown on Monday at 4:44 p.m. Eastern Time. Now, we are currently 9 hours and 41 minutes and counting from the opening of today's launch window. That opens at 6:24 p.m. And teams do have a 2-hour launch window, which means that they have 2 hours in which they can launch starting at 6:24. We are currently in slow fill for both the core stage liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen tanks. Next up will be fast fill, and I'll report out when that is underway. Welcome back. This is Artemis Launch Control. We are currently 9 hours and 37 minutes and counting from the opening of today's launch window for the Artemis II mission. Now, our launch window opens at 6:24 p.m. Eastern Time, and teams do have a 2-hour launch window, which means they have 2 hours in which they can launch the SLS, or Space Launch System rocket, and Orion spacecraft that will send 4 astronauts around the moon and back. Now, the Artemis launch team, they're currently in firing room 1, like you see on your screen there. They are right now in the process of loading cryogenic or super cold liquid propellant onto the SLS rocket. We are now in our fast fill operations for the core stage liquid oxygen tank. This means that we just completed the slow fill on that tank, and we have now transitioned into fast fill, which means we are now starting to load liquid oxygen at a much faster rate. Now, on the hydrogen side, we are still in slow fill for liquid hydrogen. So slow fill for liquid hydrogen, fast fill for liquid oxygen on the core stage. Now, just to throw some numbers at you guys again, the hydrogen tank on the core stage holds roughly 537,000 gallons. The liquid oxygen tank, meanwhile, holds roughly 196,000 gallons. On the upper stage, in total, that's also another 24,000 gallons. So you have 4 tanks, over 750,000 gallons of liquid hydrogen and oxygen that is being fed all to these engines, to the 4 RS-25 engines at the bottom of the core stage and the 1 RL-10 engine that's at the bottom of the upper stage. And now, why do we need so much propellant? Because we're sending our astronauts around the moon. We are going into deep space. We're going farther than we have since our Apollo missions in 1972. Now, again, all of this liquid propellant feeds the engines that are at the bottom of those stages for this tremendous and magnificent rocket that we see out there on the pad. In fact, in total, SLS is roughly 322 feet tall. It's taller than the Statue of Liberty. And it will send our astronauts around the moon. We have our commander, Reed Wiseman, pilot Victor Glover, and mission specialists, Christina Cook and Jeremy Hansen. You can see them there on your screen. From left to right, you have Victor, Jeremy, Christina, and Reed. They'll be getting ready to start their day and get on board their rocket for their mission around the moon. Now, Artemis II is a test flight. This is the first crewed test flight performance in a deep space environment. We'll perform a flyby around the moon. We'll practice a proximity operations demonstration with the upper stage. All in preparation for our future Artemis missions, for when we land humans back on the lunar surface. So to quickly recap of where we are in today's countdown, we are currently underway in our fast fill operations for the liquid oxygen tank on the core stage. That is the first stage of the SLS rocket. And we are still in our slow fill operations on the liquid hydrogen side on the core stage. I'll report back once we have started fast fill for that liquid hydrogen tank. This is Artemis Launch Control. If you are just joining us, we are currently 9 hours and 23 minutes and counting from the opening of today's launch window for the Artemis II mission. I'm Antonia Jaramillo in NASA Communications, and I, along with our fellow commentators, will be taking you through the rest of today's launch countdown, as well as the rest of the Artemis II mission. NASA will be providing 24/7 live coverage, starting with our propellant loading operations that is currently underway and will continue all the way through our splashdown operations. Now, the Artemis launch team, which you just saw there on your screen, they are in the process of loading cryogenic or super cold liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen onto the SLS, or the Space Launch System rocket. That's a view of the rocket right there at Launch Pad 39B, where it will lift off for the agency's Artemis II mission. Now, Artemis II is a test flight. We will be sending our astronauts, Commander Reed Wiseman, pilot Victor Glover, and mission specialists Christina Cook and Jeremy Hansen on a 10-day mission around the moon and back. Now, we are currently again underway with our propellant loading operations. We are in what is called slow fill for the core stage liquid hydrogen tank and fast fill for the liquid oxygen tank. Now, slow fill refers to slowly loading that propellant. This is done so that teams are monitoring how the hardware is receiving this super cold, hazardous propellant that is being onboarded on the rocket. Following slow fill, that then transitions into fast fill when we start loading that propellant at a much faster rate. So oxygen is currently already in fast fill, and liquid hydrogen will soon follow suit. Now, you can see there on your screen on the rocket, you can see maybe some little like checker marks that look to be on the solid rocket boosters. Those are the two nose cone shaped boosters in between on either side of the core stage. Now, what do those black and white checkerboards and squares and circles mean? Well, these are our photogrammetric markings. They serve as imagery references for the engineering photo and video documentation as for the post-flight analysis of how SLS attitude and its position relative to the ground structure during liftoff and ascent performed. So they're not just on there randomly, they do serve a purpose. And it is, again, for all of that post-flight analysis. Now let's take it back over to the firing room. And let's take a look at our launch team. You can see there you have Charlie Blackwell Thompson. She's right now walking around on the first upper level row. She is our Artemis launch director. She's currently wearing a green blazer, and you might see some other folks around the room also wearing green a lot. Why green? Well, at NASA, we love our superstitions and we love our traditions. And for the launch team, green is one of those fun traditions that they like to carry on. Green for them means go, so they wear green for good luck. Now, the launch team, they communicate with each other via these communication channels to update how we are in the countdown. I'll be monitoring those loops, and I'll report out as each call out is made. The team actually just reported that we have now transitioned from slow fill to fast fill on the core stage liquid hydrogen tank. This means we are now in fast fill for both liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. Now, following fast fill, teams will then transition into what is called topping. Topping just refers to finishing up the last little bit that is needed to get to 100% level on both tanks. Once we finish topping, we will then enter what is called replenish mode. And this means that the teams are just constantly replenishing these tanks to maintain 100% flight level. This is done because as the temperatures of these liquid propellants naturally warm up throughout the countdown, they will start venting off into a gas state. And so because of that, the teams want to constantly be replenishing the tanks so that they're not losing any propellant and we're going down from that 100% level. So again, we are now in fast fill for both core stage liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. On the upper stage, meanwhile, we haven't started our propellant loading operations there. I will report out once that process is also underway. Teams will first start with chilling down the upper stage liquid hydrogen tank. And because the upper stage is so much smaller than the core stage, it actually gets to skip a step in its propellant loading operations, and it goes straight from chill down to fast fill. And really, this is done again because of the sizes of these tanks. On the core stage, you have the liquid hydrogen tank that fits roughly 537,000 gallons of liquid hydrogen. The liquid oxygen tank, meanwhile, holds roughly 196,000 gallons. In total, that's about 733,000 gallons on the core stage alone. On the upper stage, meanwhile, the total amount of propellant is roughly 24,000 gallons, so significantly smaller. And because of this, they are able to go straight from chill down into fast fill. Now again, we have not started our propellant loading operations on the upper stage, also known as the interim cryogenic propulsion stage. I'll report out once that process is underway. But to quickly recap, we are in fast fill for the core stage liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. Now, all of these tanks on both the core stage and the upper stage are going to feed the engines underneath those both stages. On the core stage, there are 4 RS-25 engines. You see them there on your screen right there. So both the liquid hydrogen and the liquid oxygen tank, they feed those 4 RS-25 engines that start at roughly T-minus 6.36 seconds until liftoff. That's when they get ready. And then on the upper stage, the liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen tank feed that 1 RL-10 engine. Now, combined with the solid rocket boosters, SLS produces roughly 8.8 million pounds of thrust. In total, it is 322 feet tall, taller than the Statue of Liberty. In fact, let's break down the rocket for you a little bit. So up there at the top, we have our Orion spacecraft. Right underneath is actually then what is called the Orion stage adapter. That's when the SLS rocket actually starts. The Orion stage adapter is the smallest portion of the rocket, roughly 5 feet tall. Underneath that is then our upper stage, or that interim cryogenic propulsion stage. Then you'll see this nose cone orange shape underneath. That's the launch vehicle stage adapter. It's actually enclosing part of that upper stage for protection. Underneath the cone-shaped structure is our core stage. That is the first stage. It has that pretty butterscotch color. And that is due to the thermal protection system, the foam that is used to, again, protect the rocket. On either side of the core stage are the 2 solid rocket boosters. And then down, Right at the bottom are the 4 RS-25 engines. All right, so we are in fast fill again for core stage liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. I'll report out when the next milestone is underway and when we start our upper stage loading operations. This is Artemis Launch Control. We are currently 8 hours and 58 minutes and counting from the opening of today's launch window for the Artemis II mission. That launch window opens at 6:24 p.m. Eastern Time later today. Teams do have a 2-hour launch window in which they can try to launch, so if we don't launch right at 6:24 p.m., that is okay. You're looking at a live view of our Artemis launch team. They are in the process of loading liquid propellant on board the SLS, or the Space Launch System rocket. We're currently in the process of loading liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen on the core stage of the SLS rocket. Now, the core stage is the first stage of that rocket. You can see there on your screen, it is the orange section in between the two solid rocket boosters. That's actually a great view of our rocket at Launch Pad 39B. I mean, you can see it is a beautiful day. We have some puffy white clouds, blue skies, all in all, very favorable weather. In fact, our launch weather officers, they've been predicting 80% chance of go for our launch window this evening. Now, there at the bottom of the rocket are our 4 RS-25 engines. Each engines are roughly the size of a compact car. The solid rocket boosters, those are the 2 white rocket boosters and on either side of the core stage. Each booster is taller than the Statue of Liberty, and they also hold the entire weight of the rocket. Now, fully fueled, SLS weighs 5.74 million pounds. And again, you can see on your screen, you might see some gas that's being vented off underneath the rocket and the mobile launcher. The mobile launcher is that gray shape structure that is connected to the rocket. It's essentially what is providing all of the power, the propellant, the coolants, everything, all the access points to keep the rocket and the spacecraft alive and functioning and running until it is ready for launch. Now, that gas that you're seeing being vented off, it doesn't mean we're getting ready to lift off anytime soon. It's just that natural boil off that is coming from the propellant that is being fed to the rocket as it naturally warms up over time. So totally normal. We expect to see it. You'll probably expect to see it some more as we actually transition and continue with our propellant loading procedures and move forward into the upper stage, which is that second stage on top of the core stage, also known as the interim cryogenic propulsion stage. When we also start loading propellant on board that second stage, you might also see some gas also starting to vent off at that higher level. In fact, you see there on your screen is a nice, better, closer up view of the upper stage and then our Orion spacecraft up on top. Now let's take you to a graphic of where we currently are in our tanking operations. You see there on your screen, on the left-hand side, it will tell you how far we are in our core stage loading operations. We're currently 28% of the way filled in liquid oxygen and about 30% of the way filled for the liquid hydrogen side. Meanwhile, for the interim cryogenic propulsion stage, that upper stage, you see it's all grayed out there because we haven't begun that propellant loading operations. I'll report out once that is underway. But for right now, we're just focusing on the core stage. Now, in the meantime, while the launch team is right now starting to fuel the rocket and that propellant loading is underway, our astronauts are getting ready to wake up and start their day. As a reminder, we will be sending 4 astronauts around the moon and back. Commander Reed Wiseman, pilot Victor Glover, and mission specialists Christina Cook and Jeremy Hansen will go on a 10-day mission around the moon. Artemis II is a test flight where we are going to test the life support systems with our flight crew on board. This is NASA's first crewed Artemis mission, and it will pave the way for our future Artemis missions for when we land humans back on the lunar surface. So to quickly recap, we are in fast fill for our core stage liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. And I'll report out once our upper stage propellant loading operations are underway. This is Artemis Launch Control. We are currently 8 hours and 45 minutes and counting from the opening of today's launch window for NASA's Artemis II mission. Now that launch window opens at 6:24 p.m. Eastern Time, and teams do have a 2-hour launch window, which means that they can try launching within those 2 hours if they are unable to hit it right at the start at 6:24. Now, the Artemis launch team is currently loading super cold or cryogenic liquid propellant onto the SLS or Space Launch System rocket. We're currently in our fast fill operations for the core stage liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen tanks, and the teams just reported that they are also now starting their chill down operations for the liquid hydrogen tank on the upper stage, or that second stage of the SLS rocket. You can see a great view of it there on your screen. It sits right up on top of where you have the nose cone shape structure. That's orange. Up on top there is a portion of that upper stage, also known as the interim cryogenic propulsion stage. And then, if you're curious, the nose cone structure shape, that is called also the launch vehicle stage adapter. It is a part of the rocket, and it is enclosing also a portion of the interim cryogenic propulsion stage. This is done for protection, so you don't see the engine that's underneath that second stage, but it is underneath there, hidden behind the launch vehicle stage adapter. So again, we are now starting our chill down for the liquid hydrogen on our upper stage. Following that, we will then transition into fast fill for liquid hydrogen on the upper stage. Meanwhile, on the core stage, that is the first stage of the rocket, fast fill is already underway. There's a great profile shot. So right underneath that nose cone shape is then that cylinder orange structure. That is the core stage. It is one of the tallest first stages of a rocket that NASA has ever used for any mission. It's roughly 212 feet tall. In fact, in total, the SLS rocket and Orion spacecraft sit at roughly 322 feet tall. Now I'll report out once chill down is complete on the upper stage and we have transitioned into fast fill. As a quick recap, Artemis II is scheduled to launch no earlier than 6:24 p.m. Eastern Time this evening. Teams do have a 2-hour launch window. And this mission will be sending 4 astronauts around the moon and back. We'll be sending NASA astronauts Reid Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Cook, and Canadian Space Agency astronaut Jeremy Hansen on a 10-day mission. They actually just got the go not too long ago to actually start waking up and officially start their launch day. Now that's a great view of our SLS rocket at Launch Pad 39B. Oh, we just switched it, but as you saw there, it's a gorgeous day here on the Space Coast. We have some beautiful blue skies, some puffy white clouds. Our launch weather officers are predicting 80% chance of favorable conditions throughout our 2-hour launch window. Now, of course, if there are any changes or updates, we will make sure to provide those to you. In fact, NASA will be providing 24/7 live coverage of this entire mission, starting with our propellant loading operations, which is currently happening, and will continue all the way through our splashdown procedures. You can see there on your screen how to watch. Now, lasting approximately 10 days, Artemis II will send 4 astronauts to test the Orion spacecraft in a high Earth orbit before becoming the first astronaut to fly around the moon since the Apollo 17 crew in 1972. Again, we are in fast fill for core stage liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, and we are in chill down for the liquid hydrogen tank on our upper stage or interim cryogenic propulsion stage. Good morning from Florida Space Coast. This is Artemis Launch Control. We are currently 8 hours and 30 minutes and counting from the opening of today's launch window for NASA's Artemis II mission. I'm Antonia Jaramillo in NASA Communications, and if you're just joining us, the Space Launch System, or SLS rocket, is in the process of cryogenic propellant loading. That means the launch team that is currently in Firing Room 1 that you see on your screen there are loading the cryogenic or super cold liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen on the SLS rocket, fueling it for flight. Now, the team just reported that we have now started our fast fill operations on the liquid hydrogen tank on our upper stage of the SLS rocket. That is also called the interim cryogenic propulsion stage. It is the second stage of our SLS rocket. You have a great view of it there on your screen. Up at the top, if you see, you have the Orion spacecraft. Underneath there will be then actually the smallest section of the SLS rocket known as the Orion stage adapter. And then shortly underneath that is our interim cryogenic propulsion stage. Now, teams are now starting the fast fill operations for liquid hydrogen. Now, fast fill, as the name suggests, means that teams are just loading this propellant at a faster rate. Now, following the liquid hydrogen operations on the upper stage, teams will then also work on their propellant loading operations for the liquid oxygen tank that is also in there. In total, the SLS rocket has 4 tanks, 2 liquid hydrogen and 2 liquid oxygen, one of each on each stage. So you have there our upper stage, or the interim cryogenic propulsion stage, and then underneath sits the core stage. That is the first stage and the main stage of the SLS rocket. It is the orange segment that you see there on your screen in between the 2 solid rocket boosters. We are also in our fast fill operations for both liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen on the core stage. So fueling is well underway, and everything is looking good so far for our 2-hour launch window that opens at 6:24 p.m. Eastern Time this evening. Now, Artemis II is scheduled to lift off from Launch Complex 39B. That's what you see there on your screen. That's where SLS is currently situated. And it is a gorgeous day here on the Space Coast. We have some beautiful white puffy clouds and some clear blue skies. We're looking at 80% chance of favorable weather conditions. And our astronauts that are getting ready to launch on this historic mission are now starting their day. They woke up not too long ago and will pretty soon go through all of the checkouts and steps that are needed before they're ready to get on their rocket. There's a picture of them on your screen there. From left to right, we have the pilot, Victor Glover. Then you have our mission specialist, Jeremy Hansen, and right next to him is our other mission specialist, Christina Cook. Next to her is then our commander, Reed Wiseman. These 4 astronauts will go on a 10-day mission around the moon and back on board the Orion spacecraft. Now, fun fact, you see again there, we were talking a little bit about the different sections of the rocket, and we mentioned briefly the Orion stage adapter. Now, the Orion stage adapter is the last section of the SLS rocket. It's what sits in between the interim cryogenic propulsion stage and the Orion spacecraft. And it's also what houses our secondary payloads, or these shoebox-sized CubeSats, that will be providing and conducting scientific experiments. They'll be deployed shortly after separation from the upper stage and the spacecraft, and they will go to their specific destination in space to conduct scientific data. Now, inside the Orion stage adapter, fun fact, our astronauts, so Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Cook, and Jeremy Hansen, They actually got the opportunity to sign the interior of the OSA, or that Orion stage adapter. So their names are on that rocket. It is fully built by NASA at Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. Now going back to the upper stage, that interim cryogenic propulsion stage, it holds roughly 24,000 gallons of liquid propellant. The liquid hydrogen tank is approximately 17,000 gallons, and the liquid oxygen is roughly 6,000 gallons. Much smaller in comparison to the core stage, that holds roughly 733,000 gallons total. You have a 537,000 gallons of liquid hydrogen on the core stage tank, and then roughly 197,000 or 196,000 on the liquid oxygen tank. Fully fueled, SLS weighs about 5.74 million pounds of thrust. And now all these 4 tanks, the one on the upper stage and the one on the core stage, they feed, all those tanks, they feed into the engines at liftoff. So the core stage will feed the 4 RS-25 engines that you see at the bottom of your screen there. And the upper stage, meanwhile, will feed its 1 RL-10 engine that is actually enclosed by the launch vehicle stage adapter. That is the nose cone shaped orange structure that you see on your screen there. It is actually hiding the RL-10 engine from our view. But this is done on purpose to protect the upper stage. So to quickly recap, we are in fast fill for liquid hydrogen on our upper stage. We have not started our propellant loading operations on the liquid oxygen tank yet. I'll report out once that operation is underway. And on the core stage, meanwhile, we are still in our fast fill operations for both tanks, for both liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. This is Artemis Launch Control. We are currently 8 hours and 6 minutes and counting from the opening of today's launch window for the Artemis II mission. Now that launch window opens at 6:24 p.m. Eastern Time this evening. Teams do have a 2-hour launch window, which means that if we don't launch right at 6:24, they do have an additional 2 hours in which they can try to launch. Now the launch team, which we see here on our screen, they're currently in Firing Room 1 at NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. They're in the process of loading liquid propellant onto the SLS rocket. Now it's not just the launch team that's here in the firing room that is helping and is on console for today's launch, but we also have supporting teams across the country that are tuning into this countdown. One of those teams is actually the Artemis Mission Management Team. They recently just got here on console. They have a separate section and room. If you actually look, it's to the right-hand side of our launch director and assistant launch director, Charlie Blackwell Thompson and Jeremy Graber, respectively. Over there on the right-hand side where you kind of see that glass enclosure structure, in there is where our Artemis Mission Management Team will sit for the duration of today's countdown. Now, they just recently arrived on console. And apart from the mission management team, we also have the mission control team at NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston and the SLS Engineering and Support Center at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center. And this doesn't include the other several contractor locations that are also around the country supporting this launch and this mission.